My ex crashed my wedding screaming, "You abandoned me, you can't marry her." In front of 150 guests, I said, "What?" As my new wife's parents turned on me, dinner stopped, and the room went silent. Weeks later, I found out who put her there. I'm Ethan, 33M, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened at my wedding 6 weeks ago. This story has everything: toxic in-laws, financial manipulation, and the kind of family betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. Let me start with some background. I own 3 small auto repair shops here in the Midwest, 2 in our main town, and 1 about 30 minutes out in the county. Nothing fancy, but they're profitable and keep me busy. I started the first shop right out of high school with money I'd saved from working nights at a tire store, and I've built it up over the past 15 years. It's honest work, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished. I married Megan, 28F, who works as an accountant for a tech company downtown. She handles payroll and benefits for about 200 employees, makes good money, and seemed to understand the value of building something from the ground up. On paper, we seemed like a perfect match. Both responsible with money, both hard workers, both ready to settle down and start a family. But I should have paid more attention to the red flags from her family from the very beginning. Before Megan, I was engaged to Sierra, 29F, for about 8 months. Sierra and I had been together for 2 years when she suddenly asked for a break to figure some things out. I was confused, but agreed to give her space, thinking maybe she was just having cold feet about marriage. We'd already sent out save the dates, had deposits down on a venue, the whole thing. 2 weeks later, I found out through mutual friends that she was dating my former best friend Dylan. Not just dating. Apparently they'd been together for months before she asked for the break. I saw photos of them at restaurants we used to go to, at places that were supposed to be ours. The whole relationship had been a lie while she figured out her exit strategy. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It was the loss of a friendship I'd valued since college, and the humiliation of realizing that people I trusted had been lying to my face for months. I cut contact with both of them, and focused on moving on with my life, though it took me the better part of a year to trust anyone again. That's how I met Megan about a year later, through a friend who thought we'd be good together because we were both ready for something real after bad breakups. Megan seemed different from Sierra in all the right ways. She was straightforward, financially responsible, had clear goals for her career. She talked about wanting stability, about building something lasting with the right person. After the drama with Sierra, Megan's practical approach to relationships felt like exactly what I needed, but her family was immediately problematic in ways I tried to ignore because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't get along with his girlfriend's family. Her parents, Harold, 59M, and Patricia, 57F, had very traditional ideas about marriage that didn't match how Megan and I actually lived our lives. Harold works in middle management at an insurance company and has never advanced much beyond that. But he talks like he's some kind of business titan. Patricia hasn't worked outside the home since Megan was born, and she seems to resent any woman who makes different choices than she did. From the first time I met them, they kept asking when Megan was going to quit her job. Not if, when. They'd make comments about how a woman's place is supporting her husband, and how Megan was wasting her time with career nonsense when she should be focused on being a wife and mother. What bothered me wasn't that they had traditional values. I could respect that even if I disagreed, but that they seemed to think their values should override what Megan and I had decided for our own relationship. We'd talked extensively about both of us continuing to work, about splitting household responsibilities, about building a partnership where we both contributed financially and domestically. Megan always laughed these comments off or changed the subject, but she never directly contradicted them either. When I'd bring it up later, she'd say her parents were old-fashioned, but that it didn't matter because we knew what we wanted. I told myself she was just trying to keep the peace with her parents. Her younger brother Kyle, 25M, was another issue entirely. This guy had a new business idea every month and was constantly asking Megan for money to fund his latest scheme. App development, drop shipping, cryptocurrency trading, selling knives door to door, whatever was trending. Kyle was convinced he could make millions if he just had enough startup capital, and Megan always said yes. Every few weeks, She'd transfer him anywhere from $500 to $2,000 without discussing it with me first. When I brought it up, she'd say it was her money and she could spend it how she wanted, which was technically true but felt like a red flag for how we'd handle finances once we were married. "He's my little brother," she'd say. "I want to help him succeed." I'd point out that constantly bailing him out wasn't helping him learn to manage money or evaluate business opportunities realistically. But Megan would get defensive and say I didn't understand family loyalty. The wedding was at a nice hotel downtown. Nothing too extravagant, but we'd spent months planning every detail and had dropped about $25,000 on the whole thing. About 150 guests, mix of our friends and family, everyone we cared about in one place to celebrate with us. The ceremony went perfectly. Megan looked absolutely beautiful in her grandmother's wedding dress, which she'd had altered to fit her perfectly. We got through our vows without crying too much. The rings went on without any fumbling, and everyone seemed happy. My parents were beaming, her parents looked proud, and I felt like we were starting our life together on the best possible note. We were mingling during cocktail hour, taking photos with family, and talking with friends we hadn't seen in months, when I heard this commotion near the entrance to the reception hall. Then I saw Sierra pushing through the crowd of guests, looking frantic and disheveled in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. "Ethan," she screamed loud enough for half the reception to hear. "How could you do this to me? You promised we'd get married. You can't just abandon me and marry someone else." The entire room went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Everyone was staring at me, at her, trying to figure out what was happening. Megan looked mortified and confused. Her parents immediately rushed over, along with my parents and several other family members. "You said you loved me," Sierra continued, tears streaming down her face in a way that looked almost theatrical. "We were supposed to be together. This is supposed to be our wedding." I was in complete shock. I hadn't spoken to Sierra in over 2 years. The last time I'd seen her, she was with Dylan at a restaurant across town, laughing over dinner while I sat in my car in the parking lot feeling like an idiot. Before I could say anything, Harold stepped forward and pointed at me accusingly. "What is this?" he demanded. "What did you do to this woman?" Patricia was right behind him, her face red with anger. "I knew there was something suspicious about you. You don't just abandon a fiancé without consequences." Even some of my own relatives were looking at me like I'd committed a crime. The whole reception was in chaos, with guests whispering to each other and servers standing around not knowing whether to continue setting up dinner. "Sierra," I said as calmly as I could manage, "what are you talking about? You broke up with me 2 years ago. You asked for a break, and then started dating Dylan. We haven't had any contact since then." "That's not true," she sobbed. "You told me you'd wait for me. You said you'd always love me." Megan was standing next to me looking like she wanted to disappear. Her family was glaring at me like I was a monster. My parents looked confused and embarrassed. That's when I pulled out my phone and showed everyone the photos I still had of Sierra with Dylan. Photos that were time-stamped from while we were supposedly still engaged. "Sierra, are you still with Dylan?" I asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. She went quiet for a moment, then turned and walked out of the reception hall without another word. The damage was done, though. The mood for the rest of the night was tense and awkward. People kept staring at me, whispering to each other. Megan barely spoke to me for the rest of the reception, and when we got back to our hotel room, she just said she was tired and went to bed without talking about what had happened. I lay awake that night wondering if I'd just married the wrong person, or if the shock of Sierra's disruption was just making everything seem worse than it actually was. Update 1. Things have gotten significantly worse since our honeymoon, and I'm starting to think the wedding incident was just the beginning of much deeper problems. During our week in Hawaii, Megan and I barely talked about what happened with Sierra. Every time I brought it up, she'd say she didn't want to ruin the honeymoon by dwelling on drama. But the whole trip felt forced and uncomfortable, like we were both pretending everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. When we got back, her family ramped up their criticism of me in ways that felt coordinated and deliberate. They started showing up at our house unannounced, always with complaints about how I was handling married life. Harold would make comments about how I was financially irresponsible, because I'd bought Megan a nice engagement ring instead of investing in her future, by encouraging her to start a family business or quit her job. Patricia would criticize everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to what kind of car I drove. always with implications that I wasn't good enough for their daughter. But the money situation with Kyle got completely out of control. 2 weeks after we got back, I discovered that Megan had transferred $3,500 to her brother for some new cryptocurrency venture. This time I didn't find out until I was reviewing our joint account statements, which meant she'd deliberately hidden it from me. When I confronted her about it, she got defensive and said Kyle was family and that I needed to be more supportive of his ambitions. "It's an investment," she said. "He's going to pay it back with interest once his business takes off." I pointed out that Kyle had never paid back any of the previous loans, and that we'd agreed to discuss any major expenses before making them. "I don't need your permission to help my brother," she said. "That money came from my paycheck." But that wasn't really the point. We were married now, supposedly building a life together, and she was making unilateral financial decisions that affected both of us. The breaking point came 2 weeks ago during a family dinner at our house. I'd cooked, thinking maybe a nice meal in a relaxed setting would help improve the family dynamics. Instead, Patricia spent the entire evening making passive-aggressive comments about the Sierra situation. "It's just so strange that an ex-fiancé would show up at someone's wedding," she said while cutting her steak. "Usually when that happens, it's because there are unresolved feelings on both sides." Harold nodded along. "A woman doesn't make a scene like that unless she's been led on somehow." Kyle, who'd had several beers by this point, was even more direct. "Honestly, it seemed kind of staged to me. Like maybe you set the whole thing up to make yourself look like the victim." I put down my fork and looked around the table. Megan was staring at her plate, not saying anything to defend me. Her parents were nodding like Kyle had made a brilliant observation. "Are you seriously suggesting that I paid my ex-girlfriend to crash my own wedding to make myself look good?" I asked. "I'm just saying it's convenient," Kyle shrugged. "You get to be the innocent victim and she's the crazy ex. Pretty convenient timing." That's when I lost it. I told all of them to get out of my house immediately. I was done being polite, done trying to win over people who were determined to think the worst of me no matter what evidence I provided. Harold started yelling about disrespect. Patricia accused me of having anger issues. Kyle called me an asshole and said he'd been right about me from the beginning. Through all of this, Megan said nothing. She just sat there while her family attacked me in our own home, then followed them to the door like she was embarrassed by my reaction instead of theirs. After they left, I expected her to apologize for their behavior, or at least acknowledge how inappropriate they'd been. Instead, she told me I needed to call them and apologize for overreacting. "They're my family, Ethan," she said. "You married me, which means you married them too. My family is my priority, and you need to accept that." That sentence hit me like a punch to the stomach. Not, "we're a family now," or "we need to work together." My family is my priority. We've been in a cold war ever since. Megan has been staying at her parents' house most nights, coming home only to get clothes or pick up mail. When she is here, she acts like I'm the one who owes everyone an apology. I've started meeting with a divorce attorney, not because I want my marriage to fail, but because I'm beginning to understand that it might already be over. Update 2: I filed for divorce last week. The conversation that led to that decision was probably the most eye-opening 20 minutes of my entire life. Megan was shocked when the papers were served, which tells me she genuinely thought I would just accept being treated like a second-class citizen in my own marriage indefinitely. She came to the house crying, asking how I could give up so easily, and saying we needed to try counseling before taking such a drastic step. "This isn't easy," I told her. "This is the result of months of you choosing your family over our marriage every single time there's a conflict." She tried to argue that I was being unfair, that family relationships are complicated, that I needed to be more understanding of her position. But here's what really sealed it for me. Her family hired a lawyer and tried to claim that I was financially controlling Megan by questioning her transfers to Kyle. They painted a picture of me as someone who monitored her spending and didn't allow her to help her family. The reality, which our bank statements clearly showed, was that Megan had transferred over $12,000 to Kyle in the 8 months we'd been together, always without discussing it with me first. Meanwhile, I'd never once prevented her from spending her own money on anything. The divorce was finalized about 3 weeks ago. It was amicable in the sense that we didn't fight over assets. We'd only been married for a few months and didn't own much together. But the emotional damage was permanent. I thought that would be the end of it, but But yesterday I got an email that completely changed my understanding of everything that had happened. It was from Sierra. She apologized for disrupting my wedding and said she'd been feeling guilty about it for months. But then she told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 weeks before my wedding, Patricia had contacted Sierra through Facebook. She'd offered Sierra $2,000 to show up at the reception and cause a scene. Patricia had coached her on exactly what to say, how to make it look like I had abandoned Sierra and left her heartbroken. Sierra included screenshots of their text conversation. Messages from Patricia saying things like, "You need to make it clear that Ethan promised to marry you," and "The more emotional you can be, the better," and "This is for Megan's own good. She doesn't see what kind of man she's marrying." Sierra said she'd been broke and desperate at the time, still dealing with her own guilt about how our relationship had ended. When Patricia offered her money to tell the truth about Ethan, she'd convinced herself that maybe she was doing the right thing. But after seeing how it destroyed my wedding and probably my marriage, she couldn't live with it anymore. I sat in my kitchen reading these messages over and over, trying to process what they meant. Megan's family hadn't just failed to support me during a crisis, they'd created the crisis. They'd sabotaged their own daughter's wedding to prevent her from marrying someone they didn't approve of. The level of manipulation was staggering. They'd been willing to humiliate Megan, destroy her wedding day, and blow up her marriage just to maintain control over her life. I'm sitting here now wondering whether I should tell Megan what her mother did. Part of me wants her to know the truth about the people she chose over me, but another part of me thinks it might be kinder to let her keep believing that our marriage failed because of incompatible priorities rather than learning that her family actively sabotaged it. Final update. I decided Megan deserved to know the truth about what her mother had done, regardless of how painful it might be for her to learn it. I called and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. She seemed hopeful that maybe I was reconsidering the divorce, but I made it clear this was just about sharing some information she needed to know about her family. I printed out the screenshots Sierra had sent me and handed them to her across the table at a small cafe downtown. Watching her read through those messages was one of the most difficult things I've ever witnessed. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished. Her face went through about 10 different emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally this deep sadness that I'd never seen from her before. "I need to go home and talk to them," she said quietly. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. When she finally called, she was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. The confrontation with her family had gone exactly as badly as you'd expect. When Megan showed Patricia the screenshots, her mother didn't even try to deny it. "I was protecting you from making a terrible mistake," Patricia had said. "A mother has the right to save her daughter from a man who would abandon her." Harold backed up his wife completely, saying that families have the right to intervene when they see their children making bad decisions. Kyle's reaction was the worst, though. According to Megan, he actually laughed and said it was just a harmless prank, and that I was being dramatic about the whole thing. None of them seemed to understand that they'd deliberately destroyed their daughter's wedding day, and potentially her marriage. They couldn't see past their own desire to control her life to recognize the damage they'd done. Megan begged me to meet with her again. She apologized for not defending me, for prioritizing her family over our marriage, for not seeing how toxic they were until it was too late. "I want to fix this," she said. "I want us to try again. I understand now why you felt like you couldn't trust me." I felt terrible for her, honestly. Learning that your mother sabotaged your wedding and your family supported it had to be devastating. But I also knew that our fundamental problem hadn't changed. "Megan," I said, "even if your mother hadn't paid Sierra to crash our wedding, you still chose not to defend me when I was being attacked by your family. You still transferred thousands of dollars to Kyle without talking to me about it. You still told me that your family was your priority over our marriage." I explained that while her family's manipulation was shocking and cruel, it wasn't what had killed our marriage. Our marriage had died because when I needed her support, she hadn't given it to me. She cried and said she understood, but that people could change, that she'd learned from this experience and would do better. But the trust was gone. I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering whether she'd choose me or them the next time there was a conflict. I couldn't build a future with someone who had to learn through divorce that their spouse should be their priority. The aftermath has been predictably ugly. Her family has turned their anger toward me, blaming me for manipulating Megan into cutting them off and destroying their family, by revealing Patricia's scheme. I've gotten dozens of text messages and voicemails from Harold calling me everything from a controlling bastard to a vindictive asshole. Patricia sent me a long email explaining that everything she did was out of love for her daughter, and that I was too selfish to understand a mother's protective instincts. Kyle has been the worst, though. He's left threatening voicemails, driven by my house at weird hours, and even showed up at one of my shops demanding to settle this like men. I've had to involve the police and am considering a restraining order. Megan, to her credit, has completely cut contact with them. She changed her phone number, moved to a new apartment, and filed a restraining order when Kyle started harassing her too. Apparently, when she stopped being their financial safety net and emotional support system, they turned on her as well. She's been seeing a therapist and trying to rebuild her life without their influence. We've texted a few times and she seems to be doing better mentally, but I think the damage to our relationship is permanent. The whole experience has taught me something important about marriage. It doesn't matter how much you love someone if they're not willing to choose you when it matters. All the compatibility in the world can't overcome a partner who won't defend you when you're under attack. I'm focusing on my businesses now, dating casually, and trying to learn from this experience so I can recognize red flags earlier in the future. I'm not bitter about the divorce. I'm actually grateful that I learned who Megan really was before we had kids or bought a house together. The saddest part is that if her family had just accepted me and treated me with basic respect, we probably would have had a happy marriage. Instead, their need to control Megan's life destroyed her chance at happiness and revealed their own true character in the process. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who will hurt you the worst to get their way.